Sometimes there's just things out of your control. So I'm going to cover three main issues that I ran into that cost me over $50,000 in losses in the matter of a year. So this way you'll have some insight on these topics and it'll help you be better prepared so you can avoid making the same mistakes. What's going on, everyone? So being a real estate investor and working with investors, what I've learned is not only are there a lot of ways to make money, but there's a lot of ways to lose money too, because it's a very capital intensive business. So between the financing, the renovations, and any other elements of the deal that you have, you can lose a lot of money by simply overlooking certain things, or sometimes there's just things out of your control. So I'm going to cover three main issues that I ran into that cost me over $50,000 in losses in the matter of a year. So this way you'll have some insight on these topics and it'll help you be better prepared so you can avoid making the same mistakes. So number one, financing. When you're closing a deal right at the beginning, you have a closing date. During the COVID time, there wasn't really a lot of flexibility with sellers to get extensions or anything like that. So I had a situation where I was closing a deal. I was waiting for another property to be refinanced and everything was lined up. We thought we had enough time between the refinance to complete and the closing of the second property, and everything was lined up. But what ended up happening is because of this COVID period and just this appraiser we were dealing with, who was being honestly very unreasonable. They were taking a long time, to the point where things got escalated at the bank level, and the bank was kind of investigating them a little bit. But that issue caused us to have to get a private mortgage because we couldn't get the funds out from the first property, and the A lender that was going to give us a mortgage for this new property that we were closing on, they wanted to see that the funds were coming from somewhere, because as you know, banks are very strict with the source of funds, the timelines, etc. Now, obviously you don't want to lose your deposit on the second property, so you can't just say, hey, sorry, I can't close. And during the COVID era, there was so much demand that people would just simply take your deposit and they could get another offer on the property. Nowadays, you can ask for an extension. People are more friendly because they're worried they might not get another offer. But at that time, that wasn't a thing. So essentially, I had to get funds from other places, whether it was credit, etc. And private lenders are okay with that. At that time, private lenders were even more lenient than now because rates were low, the economy was good. So we were able to close the deal. But the cost of doing that was basically paying them 3%, which at that time was between $17,000 to $18,000. And aside from that, private mortgages are double the cost of your typical mortgage in terms of the monthly amount, right? Because instead of at that time paying 2%, I was paying 7% interest, and it was interest only. So not only did I pay all that money up front, but monthly I'm losing funds. It ended up being over $20,000, $25,000 worth of losses just because of something that was out of our control. But I think there was a possibility to avoid it if we had just been better prepared and we didn't have such wishful thinking, which a lot of people did during that era of real estate because everything was going so smoothly, people were making a lot of money. But I think if we just extended the closing a little bit longer and we prepared for that in advance rather than dealing with it all last minute, if issues like this had come up, we would have been able to deal with them, because we did end up getting that refinance literally a week or so right after the closing. So it ended up working out, but obviously not the way we wanted it to, and it ended up costing a lot of money. So if you just set aside some contingency in terms of time, you can avoid a lot of those issues. Now, the second thing has to do with renovations, because renovations are unavoidable. You're always going to make mistakes, whether you're overlooking a budget, you hire the wrong person. Sometimes it's out of your control because something that maybe no one expected. So for us, we ran into this issue with the first property I got. I was doing a demolition of a pool because we didn't want to keep the pool on that property because it's a duplex, and just for liability purposes, we wanted to close it down. Now, we did some high-level research, had some conversations with contractors, and the quotes we got seemed pretty reasonable. It was a couple thousand. Now, around the time when we actually went to close the property, we ended up finding out that it would cost a lot more just because of the sheer amount of concrete and mesh and, just support that this pool had behind the concrete. So it ended up being like 3 to 4 times the amount we initially expected to pay. Now, this was my fault because if I had done more research and actually gotten solid, actual, real quotes from people that were professionals, I would have known that, hey, this is not a small job, it's gonna cost a lot more. But that ended up being an extra $5,000 to $6,000 more than we had expected. Now, similarly, on another property that I closed, which was a much older property, we were doing an inspection. We did everything, I was trying to be very prepared because I knew it's an older property and I'd learned from my previous mistakes. But what ended up happening is the crawl space access for this old property was outside. So we couldn't get access to it because there was so much snow and we just couldn't find it. So I just didn't spend enough time or put in enough effort to try to locate it, to try to contact people during the inspection because we had limited time. And the result of that was that a couple months later, after I closed the property, we find out that there's like water collecting there and it has an issue because that area has a high water table. So we probably would have discovered that. And I would have budgeted for that in the renovation because we had to install a sump pump, do some drainage, and it ended up costing a couple grand just to deal with all that stuff, get the crawl space re-insulated. So there were some costs involved with that. And then on the same property, because it was such a large property, like it was over 2,000 square feet of just living space, we miscalculated on the materials. Now, again, with wishful thinking, a lot of people, what they like to do with renovations is underestimate. So, they want to be like, well, maybe I could save 1,000 here, 1,000 there, but you're supposed to do the opposite. So now I always add a 10% contingency fund to any renovations because essentially you run into these issues where things are unexpected. It's out of your control, right? So in that case, we didn't have enough materials. We didn't calculate enough labor costs for the amount of square footage, and it ended up being a couple grand more. So just those 2 mistakes cost me like well over $10,000. Now, similarly, in that same property, one of the bathrooms we had there, it had older plumbing. So it wasn't copper, it was lead pipes. And the issue with that is they get clogged. And when it gets really cold, if there's not like a really good amount of insulation around the pipes, eventually they'll just explode. And then you're gonna have a water issue. You're gonna have a high water bill. There's gonna be mold, water's gonna be leaking. And we kind of ignored that. And, we didn't really address it. So a lot of these points I'm discussing, you can actually take those back to the seller when you're doing your inspection and get price deducted. But I didn't use that as one of the points because that was like a $2,000 to $3,000 job just to get all the pipes there changed into PEX plumbing, which is just clear plastic. It's a lot more reliable. That's the thing, like just overlooking these issues and not even like overlooking, but not having the contingency fund there in the renovation budget, it takes away from your bottom line rather than being prepared for it. Even though it might not look as nice when you're doing your initial projections, it's totally worth it. Now, the third thing actually has to just do with general delays. So what we ran into, especially during COVID, was a lot of times materials are being ordered and things are just delayed. So in one scenario, we had windows that were ordered. And because the windows were being delayed so much because of a shortage in just the supplies, and this was across the world, I believe it was a big issue in North America, we had to wait an extra 2 months just to complete the project. So that was an extra 2 months of carrying costs being added on to the renovation. So as a result of that, we paid an extra, I would say around $10,000 just to hold the property where we're not getting any income and we're paying financing fees. Now, another thing, and this is like an important one to kind of make a judgment call that can really save you a lot of money. So this property that we got, the older one that I described earlier, where, we had this large property, it also had a pool. So this time we decided to keep the pool because this is a vacation rental. Now the issue is because when we did our inspection, we avoided looking at the pool because it was the beginning of the winter. We didn't properly test it, and you have to get a special pool inspection done. We found out that there was a suction issue which prevented the water from being filtered properly. Now that makes the water unsafe. And if you have a vacation rental, let's be honest, people don't want to be in a dirty pool. So we didn't want to risk that. So we spent like 2 months trying to get this figured out, trying to address it. And before we knew it, we're already in the busy season of that area for short-term rentals. So during the busy season, we're supposed to be making like $7,000 to $10,000. Everything else at the property is done, but this pool issue now is holding us up. And we should have closed the pool, which we ended up doing anyways. But if we had done it sooner, we would have made an extra $7,000 to $10,000 and made up for some of our carrying costs that we had. But we ended up doing that later on and just learned the lesson the hard way. So if you have something like that where, maybe not addressing it at that time won't necessarily like be a big problem, but it can save you time. And it's just about efficiency, because you want to get to the next step. And if there's something that can't be dealt with right away, or that you don't have an understanding of, and it pops up last minute, you want to prepare for it in advance. And if you didn't prepare for it in advance, like I did, like I didn't check it during inspection, that sort of stuff, you want to see if it's something you can kind of push away, because you don't want to kill the whole big picture where, you're not even renting out the property, you're not getting any income, right? So we ended up closing the pool, even though we're making like $100, $200 less a night because the pool's not open now. We were still able to generate enough revenue where, it was a solid income coming from the property, and we could have just saved an extra $10,000. So all this stuff that I just described happened in the course of 12 months. Now, I'm not saying you can avoid all this stuff, because you're going to always have these challenges when you're investing in a property. There's going to be financing issues, renovations, delays, and it's out of your control. But I think the big takeaway is if you just plan ahead, you set a contingency aside. Like if you expect 4 months of renovation, just put 6. If you're expecting to pay $100,000 in renovations, put 110, 115, just set aside money, because you'd rather deal with the pain of looking at those numbers than deal with a big $10,000 shock. So if you're interested in stuff like this, obviously just subscribe to the channel, and I'm going to leave my contact info below, and I'll also leave the Hamilton investment guide there as well. And if you want access to other guides, such as one that actually addresses doing effective renovations like I discussed, you can reach out to me, and I'll be sure to send that over to you.